Everyone on air. Good morning, good afternoon. This depends on the place you are. I'd like to say hello to the 1,500 people connected to follow us, and of course to greet and thank our guests very deeply. They were able to set aside some time in their hectic agenda of activities to join us in thinking about a very difficult scenario that is happening around the world. It is difficult not just because of healthcare issues, but also because of what the health care crisis is having an impact on economic terms, how this crisis is impacting deepening on inequalities and on deepening or worsening of diversity conditions. It is no secret to anyone that the situation we had already described in many parts around the world, especially in Argentina, where a minister, quite rightly so, said that poverty had the face of a young woman. This led the university into thinking that additionally to the tasks that we had performed in the framework of this crisis that have to do with keeping our university very active based on our virtual campus and in joining the Minister of Education in the efforts that are being undertaken through educational promotion that is covering the entire country. We are also taking part in different scientific and technological fields, approaching proposals, ideas, and some interventions to different government areas, as is the case with work on the part of several volunteers from the university in highly vulnerable areas. But additionally to all this, we thought we had to include discussions and ideas that would come from people who have political leadership roles nationally and internationally, and those who are in the cultural and scientific activities, in order to maybe not find a solution to problems, but at least so to lay down on our discussion ideas and proposed solutions that will make it possible for the end of this pandemic that undoubtedly so in our country is trickling down, but sooner or later it'll end, and the end of this pandemic should be the least impactful possible, and that the aftermath should be the least harmful possible for those sectors that are more economically and socially vulnerable. We would like to discuss and exchange ideas, discuss about how we can go about making this a reality. So in order for us to get started with this discussion, I'll give the floor to Audrey Azoulay, the General Director of UNESCO. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I'd like to first say it's my pleasure, my honor to take part in this discussion of ideas and solutions. And I apologize up front if I'll take the floor in English, but this is the language in which I prepared my intervention.
I would like first to thank the University 3 de Febrero and my friend, its rector Anibal Josami, for organizing this conversation, which I'm honored to join, one in a series of very timely debates that help us think ahead in these extremely difficult times. After Europe, Latin America seems to have become the epicenter of the pandemic, with the peak still some weeks away for some of your neighbor countries. But defeating the pandemics, when we'll have done so at global level, will be a hollow victory if we don't learn anything from it. This crisis is a total social event, and it is the moment to challenge our concepts, our certitudes, and to open our eyes on things that maybe usually we do not see as we should. The philosopher Hannah Arendt said that a crisis becomes a catastrophe if and only we do rely on usual concepts and ideas to address it. And this particular crisis is a very harsh and unforgiving mirror, which, in the words of the Senegalese philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne, has revealed all that is scandalous about our world. And these scandals include the inequalities that divide the globe and compromise our common future. These inequalities, of course, existed before COVID-19, but they've been amplified by the pandemic. Today's health crisis risks becoming a major social and economic crisis tomorrow. The economic crisis is already looming and taking place in the horizon. According to United Nations statistics, 500 million people could fall into poverty in the near future. And I don't know if you saw, but there was also a publication by UNDP showing that for the first time since this index was created, the Human Development Index could decline. We will not all be equal in face of this crisis. The most vulnerable among us will be the most affected in the same way as they were the most exposed to the virus. And indeed, according to ILO, women are more likely to be affected by the impending economic crisis. And this also applies to all the young people that will be looking to enter the labor market soon. The issues of inequality is fundamental because while this health crisis, it is today first and foremost the emergency in terms of health, but the impact will have a much wider and enduring scope. UNESCO, the institution for which I work, is an ideal forum to take action against the root causes of these inequalities because the virus has affected all of the areas covered by the mandate of this institution. And indeed, the fields of education, gender equality, access to information, science, culture, the current context has revealed deep divides in all of them, and it raises also questions for our long-term objectives. I'd said that the first inequality that this crisis has revealed is our unequal exposure to illness. It is absolutely untrue to believe that we are all equal before the virus. Immune defenses may vary widely from population to population. We know that indigenous populations have already paid a heavy price and are especially vulnerable. We know that social factors play a key role, as it's been underlined, for instance, by the journalist and author Rana Ayub from India, who said that social distancing is a curious privilege for those living in the slums of Mumbai. Similarly, the question of access to water is something that exposes us very differently from one place to another. Key protective measures such as hand washing are a problem for 2 billion people around the world, and a third of whom are in Africa. This is one of the messages that we launched during the crisis through our water development report. It is also very difficult to be protected against COVID-19 when we are most exposed to the virus, and this is especially true for women. Women are on the front line in fighting the disease. According to the United Nations Population Fund, they represent 70% of healthcare and social workers around the world. It's also very difficult to face the situation without access to health system or health insurance. And this is the situation faced by half of the global population. But the second type of inequality that this crisis has revealed is its unequal impact over and above unequal exposure to the virus itself. This is especially true in the education divide, which is closely linked to the digital divide during the crisis. According to our data, half of the 1.9 billion of learners unable to attend school because of the crisis, when it was at its peak, do not have access to a computer at home. And 43% of them do not have an internet connection. And this figure, this number, rises to 82% in sub-Saharan Africa, where 82% of learners do not have access to the web. Nevertheless, what we saw is that many and most of the initiatives that were taken to ensure Distance learning, continuity of learning depended on digital technology during the crisis. For most of these children, this means that their education will be interrupted as long as school closures last for lack of alternatives. And today, our latest figures show that there are still over 1 billion affected learners by school closures, more than 60% of total enrolled learners. But however, access to digital technologies is not enough, because you also have to know how to use them. And here as well, there are inequalities, especially due to gender factor. According to one of our reports last week that we called "I'd Blush If I Could," we saw that women are 4 times less likely than men to master these digital skills. Fragile populations are also most affected by school closure, because schools are not just places of learning. They are that and foremost that, but they are also the places where children can receive affordable meals, protection, and social support. And we have seen everywhere, including in the most developed countries, the difficulties linked to losing access to affordable meals for the children, the increased economic burden on the families, the impact on poverty and demand for social support due to less access to those affordable meals. Another thing that we've learned from the past, from other crises, is that when school closes, there's a greater risk of violence, physical and sexual abuse, especially for girls. This was very clear in Africa during the Ebola pandemic, and we learned the hard way that many girls did not return to school when they reopened. And today we don't want to lose millions of secondary school age girls after the crisis. So in this very exceptional situation for education, where the inequalities are more dangerous than ever, we need to take action to avoid compromising what is our collective goal, education for all. This is the reason why we launched through UNESCO with our member states, with partners from civil society, from the media, from the telecommunication industry. We launched in March, at the beginning of the crisis, a global education coalition with now more than 130 partners, with several actions to support distance learning. The first one was to support wider internet access by mobilizing major telecommunication players like Orange, Vodafone, and Telefonica. And these companies have provided free access to educational content in first many countries of Africa, but also in Latin America and in the Caribbean. We've just reached an agreement between UNESCO and Telefonica for unrestricted use of digital educational platform Myriada X. Open access classes will be offered throughout the region with this objective of leaving no one behind. But we also know that digital solutions cannot be our only exclusive solution for distance learning. And this is why we've also supported the development of distance learning through classes using more traditional and accessible media, including radio, television, and especially community channels. That's why, for instance, we've trained teachers so that they can provide classes by radio and television. But even if the entire global population could access and use internet, tomorrow's education would be meaningless without schools or teachers, because learning is not only about techniques, it's not about coding, it's about interaction, emotion, which depend on the regular face-to-face contact. So we also rediscover the importance and the prices of schools and of teachers. So we need to work also that schools reopen as quickly as possible when health situation permits. And to do so, we have just published a guide for all member states with the support of UNICEF, the World Bank, and the World Food Programme on the reopening of schools and what we should focus on during these reopening periods in terms of content, lessons, instruction for the children. As classrooms closed around the world, so too did museums, concert halls, theaters, revealing inequalities in another field, culture. While many venues closed physically, and sometimes they were the first to close because it's where people gather and are together, other opened online. Once again, digital technologies picked up the slack, ensuring and adding a new dimension to culture. And it can, of course, be a temporary fallback for much of the cultural sector. And sometimes it also opened new forms of creativity. And UNESCO as well took part in this creative movement by inviting people to visit World Heritage sites online, or by giving people the chance to browse the resources of the open access World Digital Library. But here again, digital technology cannot be the exclusive, the one and only option. And cultural life cannot be life only online. If it were to be so, not only would it be poorer, but it would only address the half of the world population which is connected. We have today the risk of very serious economic damage for the cultural sectors around the world, and it's a major threat to the world's diversity. This risk, of course, is not a new one. All crises, all economic crises result in more concentration and the risk of standardization. And in the cultural field, this is exactly the contrary of what UNESCO is fighting for. As you know, we want to promote cultural diversity. But here we have a very serious risks to all cultural professions. The figures from the International Labour Organization show that for those working in the arts, entertainment and recreation sectors, they account for slightly more than 5% of global employment. And even in normal conditions, we know that usually the jobs in the cultural sector are precarious by nature as they are linked to creation. But this is not just a question of economics. By threatening the people and the institution that keep culture alive, this crisis threatens the diversity of cultural expression. As everywhere around the world, events that take place since immemorial times have already been, for the first time sometimes, interrupted in Japan, in Zambia, in Argentina, in Uruguay, I'm sure, in France as well. This has led to financial difficulties, uncertain employment, artistic losses at an unprecedented scale. And UNESCO, with support from its network of experts and field offices, launched surveys to study the impact of this cancellation on, for instance, living heritage or cultural diversity. And in the long term, this problem in the cultural and this loss in cultural diversity will lead to a real risk of depletion that can only be countered by proactive and ambitious decision-making in terms of public support, and also including maybe more sources of financing for the cultural sector and for creation in general, including financing from the digital world, whose places, as we've seen, has been only growing in culture. We've also witnessed the increasing weight of fake news, of misinformation, especially at a time when access to accurate information can be a question of life and death during a crisis like this one. We've seen an unprecedented infodemic that has gained ground. This is why we supported efforts to fight misinformation. One of the ways we did it at UNESCO was through campaigns, like the campaign that we've called Facts, which was relayed by major newspapers across the globe, including La Nación in Argentina. We've also launched major radio and social media campaigns in the African continent with the support of the cultural sector, artists, singers, musicians, to counter misinformation. In closing, I would like to mention another issue raised by the virus very early on, and which I think is defining for our future, the ethical issue, the ethical risk. Very quickly, certain groups and communities were targeted on the pretext of illness. Like other historical pandemics, the crisis resulted in yet another race to find a scapegoat, a race towards discrimination. In a few short weeks after the beginning of the crisis, xenophobia and racism towards people of Asian origin soared. And then after a while, as infections increased, the targets of discrimination changed, but the underlying message stayed the same. certain minorities or professions were accused of spreading the virus, of being responsible for the virus. And there is something very concerning, I think, for all our societies about the speed at which the very foundation of equality has been undermined. To measure and understand this rise in racism and discrimination, we also launched a series of research projects in coordination with some of our university chairs, or also our coalition of sustainable and inclusive cities. But this ethical risk does not just concern racism and stigmatization. The virus and the fears it has raised have shown the fragility of our ethical frameworks, how tested they are when we ask for security and protection in times of uncertainty, complexity, and fear. And especially when in our increasingly technological world, the new benefits that can be brought by big data and artificial intelligence are put on the table. And it is in a time like this that we need also ethical guidance. This guidance been provided by our commissions on international ethics, ethics of scientific knowledge and technology. And they have issued a very strong statement reminding us of our fundamental freedom and values during the crisis. And similarly, ethical debates raised by contact tracing applications have made us even more determined here at UNESCO to move forward on the first ever global recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. It's a mandate that was given to us by our member state last November, and we have now a text being drafted despite COVID-19, and that will be presented to our member states in 2021. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I would argue that Bashir Diagne was right when he said that this crisis had highlighted all that was scandalous about our world in all fields. It is now up to us to act on that, because nothing in this situation is unavoidable, but much is intolerable. UNESCO can be one of the platforms for international cooperation on this issue. And we saw that there was a lot of interest from our member state to participate in the actions that we launched during the crisis. This only spares us for more international cooperation. We can count on the different initiatives we launched on arts, the Resiliar debates, on our forums, debating, imagining the world to come, which was launched several weeks ago. And we started with the voices of women that were not very much heard during the pandemic, and in many other initiatives. But it is also a bit of a paradox that we see that we need more international cooperation facing this kind of challenges. But it is at a time when the international community is more fractured than ever. I would also argue that weakening multilateralism now means giving up all chances of being able to rise to this kind of challenges. And however imperfect multilateral institution may be, I believe that this global crisis shows that we need them more. We need to fix them if they need to be fixed. We need to strengthen them, and we need more, not less, international cooperation. I thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to listen to you and participate in the debate. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Muchas gracias por haber dado un marco internacional a lo que veníamos planteando y haber marcado la necesidad del debate, que es nuestra voluntad de participar en ello a través de estas reuniones que estamos haciendo. Quería felicitarte también por todo lo que está llevando adelante la UNESCO, contarte que junto con la oficina de UNESCO de Montevideo, Lidia Brito y sus colaboradores, estamos trabajando muy en
We are
conjunto.
working together. I would like to give the floor to our Foreign Affairs Minister, Felipe Solá. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion. We have access and the possibility to have many teleconferences in these few months. This is quite special because it is not a teleconference of ministers. This is what has been happening to me we take a look at another view on the tragedy we are living through. It is a progressive tragedy. It doesn't have this shocking content that tragedies have when they have a fresh start. But at least so in my generation in Argentina, we had another tragedy to live through. That has been dictatorship and genocide. But it is a tragedy. I mean, I feel that I have to fight on a daily basis this wake, this mourning that is progressive. It happens to all of us. It's like finding yourselves to your own boundaries and that of possibilities, and try to outgrow them. Without a doubt, the pandemic is absolutely unfair. It is not democratic. It falls on societies and it trickles down depending on how the social structure in each country is. It trickles down. Initially so, it seemed to enter through airports, through those who could fly in airplanes. This means a given standard of living and a standard of culture, but then it trickled down. That place vanished to come down and then arrive in crowded places. We have crowded places in the middle of the city in Argentina, and the evolution changed because of the social structure and because of infrastructure, the way of lack of infrastructure. If infrastructure is a positive term, then we have to say that we have a lack of infrastructure. Some are doomed just because of where they live. It's not even in having unresponsible attitudes. They are doomed. Even when they are responsible, they are doomed because of where they live, because they live in crowded situations or overcrowded situations. It's not new that many people need to be on the street because they make a living on the street. This is true in all Latin America. The greatest expression, one of the solutions, a precarious one, but a solution for poverty is fairs. Fairs where you can find lots of objects, electronic objects, food staples, etc. Many people go and sell, others go and buy, and others go and make a living. They take a bowl of soup and they do some type of informal job in fairs. In Argentina, we don't have many fairs in the area that is punished by the pandemic, Greater Buenos Aires and the capital city, but we do have some. The rest of Argentina has quite a different need. Our populational need is different. So we are not that crowded in the other areas, and there's less of a risk of COVID. COVID is focused in Buenos Aires and the suburbs of Buenos Aires, downtown. It is true that COVID reveals, it's like some sort of torch, or it's like luminol, the substance that is used at the crime scenes to reveal what cannot be seen by the naked eye, by the bare eye, and it reveals the situation ever more. This cannot take us by surprise. The situation has been the same traditionally, but it just makes it a little worse. If governments don't take a look at this with special attention and with a special methodology, to those that need to make a living on the street, whether selling or whether working, then we are dooming people to extreme poverty, people that were poor for starters, but they had in the past greater possibilities, greater chances to have food on their table. This is the first humanitarian space to take a look at. I mean, extreme poverty. And you need to have very specific, down-to-earth policies to reach to all of them. Not do we have them always, nor do we have a know-how on that subject matter. The look that summons us into having this teleconference is if we take look into inequalities and gender. And I should say, of course, there's gender inequality, and that is made more serious. Of course, that is the case. Women are the ones that have to bear the biggest burden, young and poor women, as the director of UNESCO, Audrey, said. This is the face, and this is a world face. But today we see it as the face in South America. Being South America, the more unequal continent, we are having the greatest challenge. We are not having the greatest challenge in Argentina. They all have it. We have a middle income country, but we are a country that have more than 45% poverty, and we don't know what the level of poverty will be like once we finish the pandemic. Here I am part of a government, of an administration, if you don't know it, that has a clear understanding of gender and of access to rights, not with the previous government, but the one before, by Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, to replenish access to rights, one of them being the gender policy. President Alberto Fernandez had the decision to create this Ministry of Women, Gender and Equity and Equality. And here at the Foreign Affairs Ministry, we also have a ministry. They may look red tape, but if we don't get started here, we don't have a platform, a launching platform on which to take action. The big question, the big open question is not on what the diagnosis of crisis is or the radiography of our crisis or of pandemic. The big open question is, in my opinion, in us thinking what the evils are that preceded us, that cause us to have less reaction. If we get started by Latin America, there was an integration, and now rather than an integration, there is some sort of fragmentation, and this fragmentation means neglect during a long time in many countries of all type of social healthcare agenda or productive agenda. That is concern on those that require an active state intervention to make it to the end of the month, to make ends meet, to develop, flourish, and prosper. That oblivion has a name, neoliberalism. It is lethal in countries with a high proportion of poverty, and it renders itself visible now in the lack of a healthcare system that will be supportive of the situation we are living through. Argentina has always had a strong healthcare system, and beyond having gone back in the last 4 years, it is now to date, and it has been improved, but we are all neighboring countries, and we have to think in all people, first and foremost, our co-citizens, our fellow citizens, but the ones in the region. In South America, pandemic is wreaking havoc in all countries. It is growing in many countries where seemingly they wouldn't have problems initially. So this luminol that I say that sheds light on the situation will be worse here. I go back to the diagnosis. What about the exit scenarios? The big effort we all have to make. I mean, ministers, advisors, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, is an effort in trying to imagine scenarios. Even if they are 15 different scenarios, we will have one. In view of each scenario, we should think what type of reaction we should have. These are difficult to um, predict scenarios. They are related to international relations. They are related to what is being done in regions with the war trade between the United States and Russia, with the progress of authoritarianship that has, in a way, moved over multilateral negotiation agencies to try to put on the table inequalities on several countries. In the case of UNESCO, the role being of education and culture, we find a world dominated by policies that don't put the social agenda ahead of people. They don't see the problem from a humanitarian perspective or from the side of human rights. In many cases, they pay lip service to this. This is my experience so far. And the greatest effort is in imagining how the relations will be like. Will we grow regional? And if that is the case, what is the role of assistance to poverty, inventing new ways to work? They don't have to do with commuting, telecommuting. This is necessary right now, especially in countries that have a big development of formal work. This can be replaced by telework, but the other type of work cannot be replaced. So we need to find a solution, maybe with social assistance and with assistance to many companies, whether small, medium, or large size. The future will be one whether either central countries take a true notion of what the debt means, the interest burden. They fully grasp the lack of social agenda in many places, or else this will walk down to uh, unknown territory with a very high tension. I imagine a world with greater tension domestically and internationally. Am I being a pessimistic? No, I'm being realistic. I would be pessimistic if I said we cannot find a solution. I believe we can find a solution, but we should have great conscience on this. I've been in lots of teleconferences. I see that, well, of course, excepting this one, because we have heard Audrey quite attentively, and she doesn't see what I say, but there, or in her role doesn't apply to what I say. But there are people who describe ideal scenarios, but then they walk a different talk. I mean, we all are equal, but in our behaviors, we are not. So how will these behaviors be like? Those of us in a leadership role in the state are responsible to make in our countries the defense of human rights, that of women, of the poorest people, those who are under extreme poverty, and workers' rights as well. These workers' rights include the right of business owners who pay burdens on a monthly basis. And of course, we have to put our focus on, because without them, there is no growth. Growth is capitalism. One thing is to say that growth is capitalistic, but then we don't have to forget about people, because we cannot leave multinationals in full control of the situation. Thank you. Thank you, Felipe. We have to be realistic. Realism doesn't have to imply pessimism, on the contrary, and we need to join up efforts of the public and private and of intellectual sectors and the sector of culture in order to try for it to be less difficult. I mean, in the immediate future. May I say something else? Of course you can. May I interrupt you? I apologize for having to interrupt here. If we think about the pandemic, I didn't say something that is quite remarkable. First and foremost, I'd like to thank UNESCO because it provides us the possibility to render visible in the world Argentine history. We have a good relation with them, especially commitment to human rights. Our country is one with a rigorous approach to human rights, and we take pride in that. And I hope I will always say this from this point on. The second, and we have our ambassador, the ambassador of UNESCO, Pino Solanas from Argentina. He'll be in Paris in a few more days. A big creator in culture with lots of political commitment. I'd like to officially mention that here we have a place that we worship a lot, the museum, that is the site of our memory, the former ESMA, our memories on genocide, and we want it to be a World Heritage Place to be declared by UNESCO. Of course, Ambassador Solanas will have a chance to take the flag of this forward. Thank you. Thank you, Felipe. I give the floor to Pablo da Silveira, the Minister of Education and Culture of Uruguay. You may take the floor. Thank you, Anibal. Thank you to those that preceded me in taking the floor, those that spoke before me. I'd like to use the next few minutes just to share with you a few lessons that were learned so far, which we believe we have learned in Uruguay along the last 3 months where we fought pandemics, which I believe are lessons that we learned based on discussions we have had so far. So as not to take any longer, I'll mention 6 salient points. The first one, to confirm once again the relevance of investing in science and technology. In Uruguay, in the last few months, we were able to provide ourselves with a number of elements, including diagnostic kits down to respirators or ventilators, producing them locally at a record time, at a point where it is quite difficult to get hold of these elements from international markets. This was done through a bridge that was laid down quickly between basic science researchers and companies that would help very dynamically and in extremely short workaround times allowed us to carry out lots of daily swabbings in our country. We are having a very high level of swabbings on the population level without having any scarcity issue. It's quite interesting to say that in this, the basic investigators were really basic and very fundamental. Does it make any sense for countries such as our countries to invest in basic sciences, a field where we don't expect to have returns anytime soon? And in this case, investigators on basic sciences were essential to face up to the crisis. The second lesson learned, the second confirmation, if you will, is the relevance of technology in education.
Una inversión muy grande que pasa por encima de gobiernos.
Uruguay has carried out a very big investment for over a decade, ensuring connectivity and ensuring the distribution of technology to students of basic education.
Ha sido un instrumento esencial
This has been an essential element, not just in keeping up the level of learnings, but also for us to make a number of measures. We have a strategy where right when the pandemic hit us, we decided to call off classes across the country. We only had 4 diagnosed cases in the country. First, public events were canceled, and on the next day, when we had only 6 cases in the country, we called off classes. So far, today, we managed to have a very strong relation with students and a strong commitment with teachers as well, thanks to a technology investment that of course had to be reinforced because the number of students that were related or connected to IT platforms for educational use got multiplied times 12 in 3 weeks. This demanded a very big technological effort. But the thing is, we were able to take advantage of a policy, one that is a state policy, which fortunately allowed for us to have costs in class interruption not to be that dramatic. A third lesson, which might seem contradictory, but it is not all that much, is the unreplaceable nature of face-to-face contact, the face-to-face relation between teachers and students. Distance learning based on technology basis helps us meet a number of objectives. It helps us generate a number of learning dynamic, but it doesn't really replace the face-to-face contact between students and professors. There are those who like to say that we are moving into a world where in a near future we won't be needing brick and mortar schools. In our experience, this is a prophecy that won't be fulfilled. It is a prophecy that won't be walking in the direction at which things will actually happen in real life. We are at a different stage right now. So far, we were able to control the pandemic and we were able to enormously reduce the number of cases. We don't like to raise the flag of victory because we know this is quite frail and variable, and there are countries who manage for some time to almost defeat pandemic, and then they had some kind of new outbreaks. But we are at a point where the pandemic seems to be under control. We have less than 25 active cases in the entire country. In the biggest city, Montevideo, with 1.5 million inhabitants, we only have 10 active cases identified so far today, and we are going back to classes in this framework. It's complex because this is done based on quite taxing protocols, and inter alia, they require social distancing. And for this to be possible in schools, you cannot work with the entire groups. So we are having a group of 30 students be split half and half. They come on Tuesday, the other comes on Wednesday, and we see how we can make use of technology in order to cover for those moments where we cannot have face-to-face learning or teaching. Experience is confirming that the role of teachers and face-to-face contact with teachers causes the use of technology to be put to better use, rather than when the only thing available to students is technology. A fourth lesson is the importance of social complementary programs. We put off classes, but we did not put off food services. We changed logistics. Students could not eat at school, but we distributed um, trays at the entrance of schools so that they could pick them up and bring them back to their houses. That was quite important so that the cost of interruption of classes would be socially less serious. Two concerning lessons. The first one is the resistance of social inequalities that the Director General of UNESCO was alluding to. The ones we have in the real world appeared very strongly in the world of distance education. Those that could not connect or go online that much, those that did so less frequently, those that did not fulfill that many activities on the platforms, we will assess it. Those that didn't learn that much belong to the same groups where the greatest dropout rates are concentrated with the greater levels of repetition. This is in the world of face-to-face learning. That is, what I mean is that distance learning, of course, technology helps in some things, but it's not in and of itself an instrument that will get rid of social inequalities. Those inequalities get transferred almost intact. And maybe we are not so far in a condition to assess it because we are lacking data, but they might grow bigger when distance education through technology takes a leadership role, as here was the case. And the last learning that I'd like to share with you, so as not to take any longer than assigned, is how frail the mesh of players in culture is. When public events got cancelled, well, that was quite a positive decision in terms of public health care. But of course, it did have very negative impacts on those that make a living on selling their tickets for shows, especially for Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, those that are in direct contact with the audience in all forms of arts, music, and whatnot. And even though the government created programs to offset that situation, here from the Ministry of Education and Culture, we created a fund for an anticipated purchase, early purchase of tickets. We purchased tickets that for plays that will take place in November or December, but the companies got paid for those tickets a few months ago so that they would get by this period when there was no audience. Even when relating to this type of public policies, there is a reality that is blowing very hard. In the world of culture, there's very high levels of informality. There's a high level of fragmentation, people who generate their income without being connected to organizations. For instance, musicians who play music in bars or restaurants, that's how they make their living, and they cannot be that easily spotted, and for whom it is difficult to build in the short term responses that will help us try and find a cultural solution for them. Maybe they were covered socially, but not culturally. So where activities are more institutionalized, such as the one of education, we had compensatory public policies that were developed, but in those areas where activities are less institutionalized, as is part of the world of culture, excepting big theaters or big concert places, it is more difficult for us in the short term to develop a number of solutions to these areas. This is part of the lessons that we have learned in this very hard 3 months where we have been prevented from going back to normal. The government took office in January, and on March, the first few cases of coronavirus hit our country. So our administration has done nothing but work in a situation of an emergency. These are learnings that are quite sound, that are based on data we have available to ourselves. These are part of the input that is allowing us to think ahead public policies, and I wanted to share this with you, and I thank you for your kindness. Thank you very much, Pablo. I believe that you have set on the table several topics that will be discussed by the future speakers, especially by Nicolas Trota, who will be talking about how we have gone about this in Argentina. But before that, since we have made lots of reference to gender issues, this being one of the most affected areas, also because well, I was planning to give the floor to Dora Barrancos, but I was just let know that Nicolas Trota has to leave earlier. So please, Nicolas, do take the floor right now, and Dora, you'll take the floor later.
No,
All right.
perdón, Dora,
I
perdóname a
apologize,
mí
Dora.
también, Dora,
Please,
pero
please,
debía
dear
haber
colleague,
dado
be
una
forgiving
salida del
with me, but I
ministerio.
had to leave the ministry
Agradecer
because I have
a
another
la
meeting. I
Universidad
do have
Nacional 3
to.
de Febrero
I'd like to
por la
thank
posibilidad de compartir algunas
National
reflexiones, agradecer
University of
también
3 de
a la
Febrero
universidad
for
enorme que está dando la
inviting us
oportunidad
and for this
este desafío
commitment
de seguir
of
educando
walking next
a
to
la
us,
distancia y llevar la
in this
escuela
commitment
a
of
nuestros
keeping with
hogares. Saludar
education
a
distantly
Audrey
so,
y
to say
agradecer
hello
también
to
toda la
Audrey
colaboración que estamos
and to
recibiendo
thank them
de
for the
UNESCO en
cooperation we
este
are receiving
momento
from UNESCO
tan complejo
right now. Such a difficult
para el
time
mundo
we
y
are
para
going
América
over.
Latina en
It's a
particular,
difficult world,
que sigue siendo
a difficult moment for the world and for Latin America in particular. We continue to
este,
be the more
en línea con lo que ha
unequal continent
planteado
around the
nuestro
world.
canciller
And
Felipe Solá,
along the
un
lines of what
continente
Felipe Solá,
que también
our
en los
foreign
últimos
affairs
años
minister,
ha
said,
vivido
we are a continent that in
profundos
the last
retrocesos
few years
que
we
también
have
se enmarcan
experienced deep
en la
setbacks.
profundización de la
And
desigualdad,
they, of course,
inclusive en
have
algunos
deepened
países,
inequality.
en
In some
la
countries,
ruptura de los
this has
procesos
been
democráticos.
translated
Y la
into
pandemia no nos tiene que hacer
disruptions
olvidar también de
of
estos afanes
democratic
de
processes.
democracias
We have
de
to
baja intensidad que a
remember
veces se pretenden
that
imponer en
sometimes
nuestro
there's low intensity democracies that are imposed in our continent. Sharing what the Director General of UNESCO says, I should say that this pandemic has enabled us to fully have social awareness, to visibilize how deep inequality can be. This deep inequality in our countries and also in global terms, in a world that was able to move forward in our fight against poverty, extreme poverty in the last few decades, but our world is increasingly more unequal. Technology progress, even when they might be a response to future challenge in more equal societies with greater social justice, rather than that, they have become tools of concentration, of economic concentration that also impose very big challenges to the model of nation states that get revitalized vis-a-vis the need to face this pandemic. Argentina, of course, is not exempted from such a reality, but maybe unlike other countries in the region, such as Uruguay, our country was going through a deep crisis, a deep economic and social crisis, with a strong deepening of poverty and unemployment. And amidst this reality, Argentina, in a government that had been in its position for very short 3 months, well, we had to take measures to put a limit to the impact of pandemic and the preservation of lives in our society. And that led us all to reflect upon the notion that the world will be more unequal after the pandemic. It'll have more poverty, which should define us as a society, which should define us as a government, is what should we do in containing that inequality? What is the response we can have to find a solution to that inequality? What is it that we have to deploy in order to overcome this enormously complex situations? And without going into the details in connection to what we have done in the last 3 months without classes, because the objective we are setting out for is to take a look into the future, we believe that the way to exit all these realities require greater presence of the state, a state that should be able to articulate the necessary responses and paths in order to face up to poverty, unemployment, inequality, and whatnot. As Director General was saying, this was not created by this pandemic, far less in the Latin American continent. And this exit, this overcoming of the crisis in connection to our educational agenda, the primary responsibility we have should have two components to it in order to reconfigure a society for the next few decades. These in Argentina are connected to consensus that have been built and neglected. Of course, they were neglected in the last 4 years. And these are education as a priority investment, a space to have consensus, and science and technology. In the last 4 years, where we were hit by neoliberal measures, and I will just be descriptive in my effort, we had lots of setbacks in investment in education. Argentina, for the first time, invested 6% of its GDP, 6.1% of GDP in education in 2015, meeting a multi-partisan agreement, a government that had such agenda. It reached 6.1% of investment in education, which is an absolutely necessary condition to deploy an agenda that will improve, to build better realities, so that the school is the main institution to put an end to inequalities in our country. What happened after 10 years of effort for us to come down to this level of investment? A process of market uninvestment from 6.1 to 4.8, at a point where Argentina was crumbling down to pieces socially, a weakened school that had an impact on infrastructure, salaries, programs got interrupted, such as the Ceibal plan. In Uruguay, we all admire too. And here in Argentina is Conectar Igualdad. Between 2010 and 2015, 5,300,000 computers got distributed among our students. And in the next 4 years, 2015, 2019, rather than distributing 4 million computers, 800,000 were distributed in a country, in a society that got kind of framed hard in the foreign debt, 200 millions in debt. And that means to put a frame, a tight frame. And of course, these are very present discussions. Neo-colonialism suffered by peripheral countries related to the role of multilateral credit agencies. So we need to have a deep understanding of that, because part of the recovery process has to do with the challenge that Argentina is having to renegotiate the process of the debt, prioritizing the development of the country and social protection of our people. And that is where we believe that we find situations. If we need to think about post-pandemic, we need to discuss the role of the nation state, how to manage to strengthen the capacity of the state and to give a helping hand to those that were damaged by the neoliberal policies our continent has suffered, and also because of the impact of pandemic, and how we prioritize investment in our rethinking of the state, in education, and also in science and in technology. Argentina, in the last 4 years, has suffered the fact that a Ministry of Science and Technology became just a secretariat, and it had lots of lack of investment. We need to articulate with the private sector. A great part of innovation process, R&D, are led by the state. 80% is invested by the state. We have a private sector that wasn't capable of accompanying those processes of R&D in order to give more added value to the national production, a country that many times has devoted itself to exporting our savings and importing debt, a country that has imported many times raw material and imported employment from other places in the world. These are the discussions that I believe we need to carry forward right now, knowing that many of us think that a world, the post-pandemic world, will be a different one. It doesn't necessarily mean it'll be better. This remains open, as all chances remain in life. I should say that the fact that tomorrow will be a better than today, and better in general terms than the past in our continent, the recent past, of course, because Latin America lived through its own zenith in terms of rights, with Lula, with Kirchner, with Correa and Morales, or with the White Front in Uruguay. All these aspects are moments where we need to go over our history and the limiting conditions we find in going deeper into our development. If the world should be a better one, of course, we need to walk a path that will be aiming at that. It's not just rethinking our countries or states as promoters of development and summoning the sector of capital and of work and social movements, but also at a point where in Latin America we are in darkness, we need to rethink our reintegration in Latin America, because we also went back in the last few years in those progresses. The future remains open, and I'm the one to believe that the future depends on how we correlate our strength and how we can deploy an agenda which, as our foreign affairs ministers would say, would expand our rights and would help us generate fairer societies with more equality. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nicolas. I should just say to what you said that this reduction in educational investment had another side to it. This look down on public education, this neglect to the budget assigned to public education. We have always been considered among the best in the world, but the change of attitude of the government vis-a-vis public education, well, enabled that today many of the universities in Argentina are on the front line fighting the pandemic with all sorts of contributions. And this is thanks to the current administration. I'd like to give the floor to Dora Barranco because many comments were made in connection to gender equality. And we are in a year where the Beijing agenda is having its 35th anniversary on gender equality. Thank you, dear Anibal. Thank you, Audrey, for this very inspiring communication and for having put a high standard to the gender of this problem that is brought about by COVID-19. But our Foreign Affairs Minister said, well, luminol is COVID. The situation actually was very serious before, and the tsunami of COVID only showed what actually was kind of hidden. So yes, I won't go into the details of what has been described connected to the situation of Argentina that was put on an end on December the 10th, 2019. And of course, talking about structural adjustment, this being the main thread in the last 4 years, a neoliberal adaptation that I won't be discussing into the details, neoliberal adaptations that happened in our country that had some different perspectives in connection to the deep problems that we find in our country, where we had an absolutely antagonistic opportunity where we had this over-indebtedness in our country. This one of the more serious circumstances we will have to face to leave the double situation we are having, the one that had already been prepared with this over-indebtedness and the one that is left with us with this lack of action, this impossibility to put an end to the lockdown, to our economic activity. But I will now focus on three fundamental goals. Neoliberalism is something that hits hard against women because, of course, it vulnerates their rights. It's been seen that in spite of a law, I'm talking about an activity that makes reference to 14% of women who work in houses as cleaners. That's quite an important proportion of the labor market in Argentina. And we already had towards the end of 2019, in spite of the laws that protect that job, 75% of women who work as cleaners in houses are not under the formal market. They are totally unregistered. So now with the unleashing of this pandemic, this situation has turned itself into even more precarious because, of course, they cannot go and work actively. Another aspect that I would like to refer to, considering the depth of crisis among female populations who are already in a precarious situation, we might assess it much better as soon as we can carry out some survey. But of course, today, some surveys already are showing what the situation is among people, women who are in vulnerable situations. The second thing here is how uh, telework or remote work increased among women. women in these circumstances? Well, as I expressed so far, we have this kind of double colonization. There's 50% of women who work outside from their houses, and right now, a great deal of these women are working in the public sector or in administrative activities with work limited at home. This is the opportunity where we see that there is some sort of invasion of public life in private life and in some sort of saturation of private life in public life. So if we could see the double bond that exists in connection to women, well, why do I say a double bond? This double bond means an increase. We have a number of surveys that were conducted during this lockdown period, and the surveys say that there wasn't an increase for them to be given a promotion of their salary in the day working as cleaners. I mean, platforms receiving children should be handled by mothers. It is possible then to infer that we have increased activities at households, and this means that they need to work for longer. There are women who have to work at home and also have to deal with job-related issues at 10 or 12 p.m. because they have to take care of the children. Of course, there is no limitation between the economic activity and their role as mothers. And there are 14 projects going on, 14 bills at the Congress to regulate telework. I mean, telework will not continue with the same density or with the same amplitude, but chances are that there will be far more intensive expression of remote work among women. And the last comment is how to put an end to such a situation. We have to think about poor women again, who are quite a subject matter expert in an analysis that is quite interesting among those who are specialists in economy, the analysis of the cost of opportunity, it being quite virtuous among women in popular sectors. Why do I say so? Because we know that the three first deciles of income, women in popular sectors would rather stay home because of the consequence of the analysis that may not be weighted in very conscious rules. I mean, is it good for me to stay at home or do I have to leave home? I have three children. Who do I leave them with? Well, I'll go out and make my living. I have to spend so much commuting. And what about the opportunity cost? It is not that refined, but the conclusion is quite forceful so that some women decide to stay at home. And this is one of the issues that will be quite dark because of the lack of resources of other income at the household. I'd like to conclude by saying that the Argentine state has made an extraordinary contribution to put an end to this situation, especially in those sectors that didn't have an income or that had a serious income problem. At least so, there are 5 interventions, one being quite important, IFE, that reached 9 million households. That's an extraordinary figure. How can we continue with this, which is what really matters? We need to establish the possibility of a basic universal income, especially for women in popular sectors. For the time being, universal income is originated in those cases, in an emergency situation, a contribution on the part of the state that will have to expand the opportunity for women with tax incentives, the design of which, well, it would take a long time for me to explain, but I should say that the state should impose tax incentives to expand the opportunities in small companies so that they employ more women. And I should also think about the need that today we have in those segments of dissident identity, meaning sex or gender dissidencies that are going through a problem, especially the trans population in Argentina. They are going through great vulnerability. So if we leave the pandemic and the tsunami that the pandemic brought about, we will have to focus on these measures. That is basic income, so that there is sustainability among women in popular households, especially when they are the breadwinners of those houses, while tax incentives are prepared in order to expand the possibilities of them having access to jobs in those sectors that will get dynamized or promoted slowly but surely in our country. Thank you so much, Dora. I have lots of comments on the part of the audience who are talking about migrant workers and minority populations in the countries from diverse origins and the situations of Afro descendants in the entire region of the Americas, from the South down to what is happening in the United States. But in connection to migrants, I know that Janine has received recently a distinction on the part of the German state that is connected to her work in favor of diversity and the defense of migrations. So that's the right timing to give the floor to you, Janine. Thank you, Anibal. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all that you spoke before me. I say hi from Berlin. The situation in Germany is certainly not as serious as is the case in Shantytown 36 or in favelas in Brazil. It remains clear that Germany is a wealthy nation, as you very well know. In spite of that, I should say that the situation, the critical situation we are at, the typical culture broths that are ideal for conspiracy theories. This is happening in Germany quite seriously so, and we need to somehow defend the reason and humanity more strongly so than ever. That is sense and sensibility. There is this trend in Germany of nationalism. Is I see that the image is changing. I'm interested to know whether you are listening to me. Is my voice conveyed good enough? I was talking about nationalism and the right-wing ideas, which again are a menace, a threat in the contemporary Germany. You may know the events of Hannah or Halle, the fact that a politician, a Christian Democrat, was murdered. He was in favor of the foreigners, of refugees, and he got murdered in front of his house. The right-wing movement and the fascist movement in Germany had an enormous reemergence now during the pandemic, and especially over the web, over the internet. This is not just concerning us, but it makes us see that we need to fight in a very clear manner. What do artists do? I'm an artist. I'm the chairperson of the Academy of Art. What can we do in order to offset attacks to our democracy? This is a very difficult to answer question. I can only partially answer it. Meaning, for instance, we have a big exhibition that is going on by John Hartfield, a, a very well-known comic drawer and a photographer that was well known in the 20s and 30s in the past century in Germany. And if we see his material today, it's obviously posted on the web as well, on our web page, the Art Academy web page. The political photo montages and the covers of books that he created, all the mass efforts he put together in connection to his images have a great possibility even today. When we start discussing in Germany what is the most important thing right now, and of course we say that what matters the most is to save the market, then we say culture is relevant. Culture is absolutely relevant, and without any culture, there won't be any way to overcome a crisis. Luckily so, in the Academy of Art, there was a program by the Friends Society. It got started by the Friends Society of the Academy for youth artists and former um, members, including artists from Cuba, Argentina, and I think about the Cuban blockade. And of course, it's difficult to talk about art, but we must, and we must talk about how we protect young artists, young women artists who may not have all the funds in order to repair a computer and to keep working, to have a computer repaired and keep working. We are trying to help these people, and we do so through economic incentives directly. So, in my opinion, being respectful for those who are foreigners is very essential, not just in Germany, but around the world. Being respectful for foreigners, for their singularity, for their origin, is related to seeing the face of the other, the otherness, as Emmanuel Levinas said, without taking into a look on how their eyes look like, what the color of their eyes is or what the color of their skin is, but seeing beyond that, knowing what the other needs, that is putting yourself in their shoes. We can do so being artists with our work, but at the same time, we need to do so in a very clearly political manner. In spite of what I have said so far, that there is anti-Semitism, that there is a very strong right-wing movement that is quite appalling in Germany. It's terrible. And there was this big demonstration that happened last Sunday with 130,000 people in downtown Berlin against what is going on in the United States in favor of protecting all of those who are different. So our youth are deeply mobilized because of all the inequalities that are happening in society, but also we have this peril that we are running, quite a big one. Some of the politicians that spoke before me, they spoke about the fact that there is lack of unity among countries, among Latin American countries. We live in Europe, and European countries are doing, are coming down to pieces. We are fighting again so that we have a European unity. This doesn't mean we will lock down the continent. On the contrary, we will be fighting for an open continent, but for a united Europe as well. This is why in the Academy of Art, I got started with a big meeting, including all the art academies in Europe. And this will happen in October here at the Berlin Academy, where we will be discussing about how we should be in solidarity. We don't want to keep on seeing what happened when there was a neglect of Italy or Spain, or of what was going on in Poland or in Hungary. We want there, even when we artists remain on ourselves, we might be conscious, and we may, in a solidary manner, be able to raise our voice when there is a peril, such as the one we are seeing for others. These are thoughts, different thoughts. I believe that what we are more focused on, what we care the more right now, is to have partnerships, partnerships between you and us, partnerships between those that do politics and art, trying to find voices in order to understand one another. The otherness should not be a fashion. It should actually be something that should concern us every day. Thank you for listening to my remarks. Thank you very much, Janine. What you are seeing in Europe and in Germany in particular is very concerning for us, not just because of what is going on right there, but also because there are similar phenomena happening in countries that are very close to us from all points of view. Close to Argentina, I can say so because I have no political responsibility in the state. I'm an academician myself, but there are lots of those movements in the south of America that are quite concerning. I'd like to give the floor to Pino Solanas, the General Ambassador in front of UNESCO.
Sí,
No escucha.
a ver.
Está.
Parece. Ah, perfecto.
Bueno, mi agradecimiento, Aníbal,
I'd
por
like to thank Aníbal for this initiative, and I also like to thank Audrey's participation and those that have spoken before me. And these have all been excellent presentations by the Foreign Affairs Minister and by the Minister of Education, with whom I'm united with a long relation. I won't be repeating myself, nor will I be discussing on the subjects that have already been discussed, because I wouldn't be contributing much, because many very important things have been discussed so far. I mean, coming from Argentina, with 40% of population in poverty, with 40% of workers with no social net or coverage or medical insurance of any sort of or nature, with half of the population without drinking water or sanitation, that is sewage. Well, that's quite a major problem. This problem is part of a process that has gone deeper and deeper, government after government. Evidence, well, this is the inheritance that government of President Alberto Fernandez from Frente de Todos and Cristina Fernandez Kirchner have inherited. Additionally to all that, this is a very difficult to deal with pandemic without any prior history. But we need to see that pandemic with coronavirus brought about a number of problems. Talking about social justice or injustice, well, it's part and parcel of environmental justice. And then I'd like to focus on this issue that is quite an issue that is absent. When I was nominated because you thought that I would be a good representative of Argentina in front of UNESCO, the first thing I did was to read the charter of UNESCO. And what was quite calling, on account of how positive it was, of course, was that on the preface, that is the Constitution of UNESCO, it detailed very well the reason for its existence. It showed, of course, UNESCO was born 3 to 4 months after the end of the Second World War.
Y que iniciaba la era del
That
terror
started the age of nuclear terror, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and it started another universal era. Well, the Constitution in UNESCO says in its foreword that UNESCO is born especially with instruments of education, culture, and history in order to generate greater bridges of dialogue among nations and to ensure peace. Additionally to that, UNESCO had to be instrumental to the general well-being of humanity, of humankind. Of course, it says many more things, but I'd like to be brief because then I'll be shown that the end of my time has come and I won't have been able to state as much. Of course, I was interested in many things. Of course, we didn't live through any world war. That wasn't the case in this decade. But of course, humankind has witnessed the so-called low-intensity wars that are causing millions of victims. It's not just those who die because of the effect of war, but because of the delayed effect of wars, that is famine, migrations of whole nations or of whole people together. And we also had other types of wars to deal with, and we sometimes tend to forget them, and they need to be placed above anything else. Audrey was talking about ethics and the ethical risk. That's excellent. I mean, policies or politics and culture cannot be separated from that beacon of light or that thermometer, so to speak, the ethical principles, the universal ethical principles. The fierce war that we are seeing that is shaking up the planet, the entire planet today, is hunger. There are two fierce wars. One is misery, poverty, and famine. This is continuously shown by the extraordinary discourse, the speech by Pope Francis, the fight against hunger. There cannot be any cultural wild approach that exists out there that is very little civilized. There are sectors in our countries that make 15 times more income than those that are underneath them, and those that are underneath them cannot make ends meet. They fight to have an opportunity to work, to have access to the universal right of health care and education. How come? So we have two big wars. These are two pending assignments, so to speak. One is to fight the war against poverty, and the other is to fight the war against global warming or climate change, if you want to call it this way. Of course, the environment cannot be separated from social components. There cannot be social justice without environmental justice. Environmental rights are fundamental. Why is that so? Because the entire planet today has come down to the tragedy of climate change, but that can only be seen in a number of sectors. You know, COP21 is conducted in Paris. The big leaders in the world are present. A commitment is made to reduce greenhouse effects, greenhouse gases. But then 2016 proved to be the hottest year in history. And 2017, again, the hottest, the warmest year in history. Greenland, for the first time, showed its skin, so to speak, because ice caps or glaciers had melted on that continent. We in Argentina know it really well. We have come down to COP21 COP21 with a project that showed that when there is political will, we could come down to the year 2050 by producing electricity with full renewable energies. We tested that, but that of course would have been possible if all duties were met. In Paris, there were dozens of projects along the same lines, along the same directions. But then the Argentine government, on the one side, it signed, but on the other hand, it promoted old technologies, old ways of energy, etc., etc. So it paid only lip service. An investment in clean, renewable energies in Argentina is just negligible. It's too bad that the Uruguayan Minister of Education is not here, but I wanted to praise them because Uruguay teaches us all the time 75 to 80% of energy in the country is electrical, and that energy is produced based on solar and wind energy. So with this, what I mean is that the war against the environment, the threatened environment is fundamental. 70% of greenhouse gases are the consequences of emissions by big transnational companies. That's the gist of it. 65 or 70% of global warming, if I add what is generated by the United States and by China with their carbon mines in an open pit manner, and based on what is generated by Japan and Europe, then I reached 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. And who is protecting the people in the South, the Southern Hemisphere, where our contribution to global warming is not even 10%. There's this big inequality being so big that the effect, the catastrophic effect produced by global warming is by and large suffered by all people on Earth. But the majority of human concentrations are in the South Hemisphere, and that's quite appalling because we cannot find a way to defend ourselves. There's this debt, this ecological debt of northern countries with the southern countries. We should be indemnified, paid damages because we are victims of global warming. This produces fires in forests, very long droughts, famine, hunger, and oceans that continue to rise their levels. And of course, salinity in oceans that is transformed into this rainfall. In humid Pampa, never before had 120 villages gotten flooded in the core of agriculture of Argentina. And that was so in Argentina because native forest was cut or felled. And we know that native forest is the dampening force to capture 10 times more water that can be captured by a piece of land or a plot of land that agriculture is worked on them. This is why they are treasures. We may not have gone into a different world, but we need to be fully aware of the rights of nature, Madam Nature, to call it. She has to be a subject of right rather than a subject matter of rights. In our country, in an afternoon, just a corporation is established and it has a legal standing, but there's no one to defend this tree that is 300 years old and it's fell down because it just makes the sidewalk dirty with those leaves. That's so vulgar of people. There's a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of cynicism. This is why I celebrate, Audrey, that you have put on the table ethics. It's unethical not to talk about problems in their full dimensions, in their full dimension. And as the saying goes, every evil brings along its own good, because this pandemic of COVID-19 has revealed the failure, the sudden failure of neoliberal policies in the last 20 years or in the last 30 years. They made a tuning, a fine tuning on healthcare and on education, on industries or on sectors that are absolutely essential for the development of human life on the planet. Yes, of course, these brains, the economists, sociologists, and bankers, in their hands, is it that in their hands is humankind? I should say peril, danger, humankind. We are in danger if that is the case. So one thing is inseparable from the other. When we talk about gender causes, who are in charge of the environment? Is it men or is it women? Who are more protective of the environment and of nature? Native people, or is it urban human people, human beings? I believe that there's a very strong war that we will be waging. We will be defending the environment. We will be defending life. We need to defend water. Be careful. Here we are playing with fire. Out of 3% of the water that is covering planet Earth, out of 100% of water covering the planet, only 3% is drinking water. The glaciers on the Andes mountain range are melting, and we Argentinians look the other way. Brazil, in Bolsonaro, he says, just go about it, just set out matches on the forest and set it on the forest and set it on fire because we need to plant soybean. And then the Amazonia is setting on fire, is burning on fire. So again, it is quite difficult to attack these inequalities that exist out there. They are quite ferocious and wild without placing on the table the dish where we will be defending environmental rights. And from the south of the world, from people living in the south, I will conclude by saying that there is another token of how ferocious the situation is we are at, is there is no international criminal court that will punish environmental crimes. Here you can destroy, pollute, contaminate, fell forests, set out to burst entire forests and mountain ranges. There's no judging you. You have to put an end to being complices to that, because that is the biggest sign of macro corruption and inequality. So Audrey, we are close to the time assigned, right? So shall we continue? Of course, since references were made to my nomination as a candidate or my designation as the ambassador in front of UNESCO, well, I will carry with me lots of projects. I'm an ambassador to my government, that of Alberto Fernandez, and our great Minister of the Foreign Affairs, and also Minister Trota, and the Ministry of Science and Technology. I take with me a portfolio of lots of projects along those lines. UNESCO can expand its horizons. It can expand horizons. I don't say nothing but this. Of course, there's quite an array of capacity they can take action on, rather than focusing on statements of universal heritage, which of course have to continue to exist, no doubt. But of course, we have the elephant in front of us, and this elephant has gone kind of wild and dangerous. So we have to take it from the different perspectives. Thank you, friends. Thank you, Anibal. Thank you, friends. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Pino. You highlighted quite well the element of the North and environmental justice, and also the existence of native people in our country that are contributing to that. And to the Director General, your speech, as was evidenced, generated lots of comments and lots of ideas. It spurred out lots of ideas. Of course, we will continue discussing this on another panel because the time is running short, but the conclusion should be within your words.
Gracias, muchas gracias a vos.
Thank you very much to all of you.
First, I would like to acknowledge and to thank you for the importance and the depth of all of your contributions. And it's rare, and it only happens in Argentina and Uruguay to have this kind of depth in the conversation. I think there is something common in all that we said in terms of common goods. What is a common good today? Science, education, environment, with the last intervention of Ambassador Solanas. And these public goods, it's true that we do not know how yet to collectively manage them. And we know that it's a international scale, and we know that we don't really have the systems to manage them collectively. So we have to reinvent and reinvest as well in public common goods. I would like to thank also the ambassador for his mention of the environment issues. And I think they're very linked as well to education, very linked to scientific knowledge, very linked to our capacity to protect more and more areas on our planet, seas or land, which is what we can do with the biospheres network, we can do with the World Heritage Site, etc. But we need to do much, much more. So we're in this period where we have to learn the lesson of the crisis, which is still ongoing, to prepare for other crises. And we know that at the root of the solutions, at the root of how we can fight inequalities, there is investment in public common goods. And I think it's very challenging and beautiful path that is before us. So thank you very much to all of you. And thank you very much, Anibal, for inviting me.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Y
Thank you so much. I believe that with this, we can conclude this discussion. I'd like to thank you deeply. I mean, Audrey Azoulay, Foreign Affairs Ministers, Solá, the two Ministers of Education, Argentina and Uruguay, Pino Solanas, Janine, and Dora. I believe that we have just put forward a number of issues that should have to be done and thought, where we should have to go deeper. And this evidently forces us to continue with our idea here in the university, to go deeper into this and to repeat instances like this. On behalf of UNTREF, I'd like to thank you so much for all the time that you committed participating with us. Thank you so much, and we conclude the meeting. Thank you. See you later. I thought that Pino Solanas was asking for the floor, but that was actually not the case. So thank you so much to all of you. See you soon.